Well, hello. We're going to continue to go through the Psalms, and in this lesson we're going to focus entirely on the third Psalm. The third Psalm is said to be a Psalm of David, and we are told it was written when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now this puts it in a historical context, and as we look at the scriptures, this particular account, that is David's battle and fleeing from Absalom and Absalom's conspiracy and David's eventual triumph over Absalom and his grief at the death of Absalom, all that is told in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 18. But let's begin by reading the text of the psalm. And again, it is put in this historical context of David as his son rebels against him and conspires to try to turn the nation of Israel against its rightful king. We read, beginning in verse 1, O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Now, as we read through the psalm, I did not read the word Selah, which occurs at the end of verses 2, 4, 6, and 8. Selah is a Hebrew term, the meaning of which is somewhat uncertain. It's used in the Psalms over 70 times, if I remember correctly. But we're not quite sure what it actually means. Some have suggested it means get softer, such as piano in our modern musical notation, and some suggest it means to get louder, as in forte. Many suggest that Selah might mean to pause and to reflect upon the words. But we're not, since we're uncertain about the term, we're not going to dwell on it too much. Again, it is some sort of musical notation, the meaning of which we're not quite sure of. But what I do want to talk about, first of all, is David, historically, his situation and his attitude towards that situation. This is a psalm which is written from the midst of a conflict, a time of uncertainty. And though verse 7 speaks as God striking all the enemies on the cheek as something that happens or has happened, David, as he writes this, has not reached that point of victory yet. He is fleeing from a multitude of foes. And in fact, as we look at 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 12, we read concerning Absalom's conspiracy that it continued to grow. And so David's in this situation where he's not exactly sure who's loyal to him, who's unloyal to him. He has fled the capital, Jerusalem, and Absalom is moving in and taking control of the capital, and David is kind of picking his battleground. He didn't want to fight in the capital. He was afraid that would destroy the city. So he's removing himself so that Absalom gets a momentary advantage. But still, politically, it is a time of great uncertainty. And there must have been many around David who were fearful at this time. And there were certainly some who, in that fear, were beginning to join the one that they thought looked stronger, and that was Absalom. And yet, this is a psalm about going to sleep. Consider verse 5, I lay down and slept. I awoke again, for the Lord sustained me. Even in this midst of uncertainty, David is able to sleep. Now, as we look at the structure of the psalm, if I was going to present an outline of it, I would say verses 1 and 2 present the conspiracy against David. Verses 3 and 4 present David's confidence in God. Verses 5 and 6 present David's courage, and courage that comes from his confidence. He's able to sleep because he trusts in God, and so he's not afraid. And then finally, verses 7 and 8 bring us to conquest. David knows he's going to be victorious. And as we look at that outline and we consider the psalm and we consider David's perspective, first of all, realize that David is teaching us, and God through this inspired text is teaching us, that momentary setbacks do not preclude a final victory. David's not writing this when everything's going his way, and yet he is still confident that because God is with him, he will triumph. Likewise, David here is not counting on victory because he knows his enemies are foolish and weak. No, in fact, he doesn't downplay their numbers. He doesn't doubt their strength. He doesn't even doubt their intelligence. But he just knows that God is stronger than anybody who's arrayed against him. And furthermore, David is confident in victory because he knows victory doesn't come from himself. It doesn't come from his own abilities. It doesn't come from his own wisdom. It comes from God. Verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord. And so this is David's thinking as he writes the psalm. He's in a great crisis, but he's able to sleep, trusting in God, and wake up refreshed because he knew God was with him, and he had confidence that no matter what happened, God would save him. Now, as we move away from David, it's always instructive to consider the Psalms from the perspective of Christ. And here's a psalm which, even though we know the historical context in which it was written, is very much applicable prophetically to Christ. Consider Christ on the cross. As you read, O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there's no salvation for him in God. And consider the enemies of Christ at the cross, looking up and saying that very thing. He trusted in God. Let God save him. And they didn't believe God would save him. They were being sarcastic. But Jesus went to the cross surrounded by his enemies and yet confident. He was in control of himself and the situation the whole time. Even as others were abusing him and nailing him to the cross and mocking him and reviling him, Jesus did not lose his faith in God. He could pray, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, because he was trusting in God. He could say, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, as he breathed out his last, because he had confidence in God. This was the faith of Jesus. We see it on display, for instance, in Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 26. Jesus and his disciples are in a boat, and they're sailing across the sea, and Jesus is able to lay down and to sleep. And a storm arises, and Jesus continues to sleep, and the disciples are panicking and asking him, Master, wake up. Why aren't you afraid? Why aren't you going to save us? Don't you see the waves? Don't you see the wind? And Jesus rebuked them and said, Oh, you of little faith. But Jesus was able to sleep during the storm because he trusted in God to save him. He knew that momentary problems that they didn't change the final outcome. And so even at the cross, Jesus died, trusting in God. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then they lay him to rest in the tomb. And consider the tomb as you read these words. I lay down and slept. I awoke again, for the Lord sustained me. And as Jesus went to the tomb, he could sleep, he could rest in that grave, knowing God would protect him, knowing God would give him the ultimate victory, and God raised him from the dead, and Jesus rose again. And he rose with power and authority to overcome his foes. As Jesus laid in the tomb, though, he did so without fear. As Jesus approached the cross, he didn't want the pain, but he didn't have a fear of death. As Jesus approached the tomb, he didn't have a fear of being buried in the ground because he knew who was going to be sustaining him. So he could die and be buried and rise again, confident that God would give him the victory. Now, as we consider the psalm and we consider David and we consider the attitude of Christ himself as he was laid in the tomb, we can also look at ourselves and ask, how is our faith in God? When we have setbacks, when we have great trials and tribulations, when enemies are arrayed against us, when people are saying all manners of evil things about us, can we be calm? Can we trust in God? Can we go to sleep unafraid, untroubled, knowing that if we are faithful to our Lord, if we are obedient to his commandments, if we abide in his grace, we'll have the ultimate victory. As we approach sickness and death, do we do so with confidence? Can we approach our deathbed saying, I'm going to lay down and sleep. I'm going to wake again, for the Lord will sustain me. It reminds me of the words of Job, who says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And even if my body fails, even when I die, I will see him again with my own eyes. Job could have victory even approaching death. Job rather could have confidence even approaching death in the victory that God would give him as one of the faithful. Perhaps sometimes we lack this confidence, this faith, this trust in God because we're relying on our own wisdom. We're relying on our own strength, on our own abilities. We're not trusting in God, saying, the Lord is my salvation. Salvation belongs to the Lord. The Lord, he's my shield about me, my glory, the lifter up of my head. God's the one who is going to make things right. No, rather, we want to make things right ourselves. We want to fix every problem. We want to fight every battle. We want to win every cause. We want to do it all, and we want to do it through our own constant, unceasing efforts, rather than just being calm and letting God have the hand, or a hand in making everything right, in trusting in God. A psalm again about going to sleep with confidence, with courage, being able to have a good night's rest no matter what storm is raging around us. We're all going to have difficulties, and we may not have the difficulties of David, who had his own son leading a political coup against him. We may not even have the suffering of Christ, people beating us and torturing us and crucifying us. And yet when we look at these two, and we look at other great men of faith and the trials that they faced, and they were able to do it with confidence, with faith, knowing God was going to take care of them. And then we look sometimes at our own problems. And we may have difficulty with one or two people. It may not be thousands arrayed against us. It may just be a cranky neighbor or one of our relatives who we're having trouble getting along with. And we look and we think, well, that's the whole world coming to an end. But where's our faith? Where's our trust in God? Our problems very often aren't even that big, and we lose our faith. If we lose our faith in little things, how are we going to face the great trials of life? But David trusted in God, and we know that God did give him the victory. Jesus trusted in God, and we know that God gave him the victory. He raised him from the dead, and he's seated at the right hand of God. Jesus tells us in this world, in this life, we will have tribulation, but don't lose heart. Don't be afraid. Be of good cheer, because he overcame the world. And if we trust in him, we'll overcome as well, not through our own strength or ability, but through the salvation that God gives us in Jesus Christ. I pray that you'll meditate upon this psalm, you'll reflect upon it, you'll think about how it applies to yourself. And I hope that this brief lesson has been of some benefit to you. Until our next time together, God bless you, and you have a good day.